Yeah, thanks so much. So my name is Patrick Galbraith. I'm an anthropologist. I live in Tokyo. I've been working here since 2004. My project is on the Akihabara area. So I spend a lot of time down there, and through that, I became interested in idols as kind of an extension of my field work. A lot of my informants were deeply involved with AKB48 when it came out. So I want to talk a little bit about that, and I also want to sort of enter into a dialogue with the way we usually talk about these kinds of things, because we often will talk about idols is in terms of like it's such a source of joy and pleasure and agency, and that it's a social positive social uplift and all of that. And I started to notice that by doing that, I was kind of talking about my informants in a way that maybe wasn't empowering them as much as I thought it was, because the idol industry is such a powerful force in the media entertainment industry in Japan. So, what I want to do today is kind of introduce a couple different perspectives that can sort of lead us to a critical approach. So, what I'm going to do is talk about idols in television, talk about idols in the effective market, so idols in sort of body to body interaction, so less mediated, more direct. And then I'm going to talk about sort of a critical approach coming from the Frankfurt School. So I want to go all the way back and sort of look at maybe what that kind of critical production of culture approach can teach us about this. It's a bit of an experiment. It might not be. It might not work. It might turn out that there's lots of questions about this approach. Maybe we want to go back to being more positive and more celebratory. But what I want to do is kind of provoke by going for a critical approach, because I know that idols are such an important part of so many of our lives that we don't usually talk about them this way. So let me go ahead and jump into the critical approach. So the standard celebratory approach that I've been experiencing for many years now is that it stresses human agency, values, experience. It stresses the kind of active production of culture versus passive consumption. On that sort of spectrum of things, fans would be the most productive, the most agentive. So popular culture is basically worth studying because it's a kind of space of creation and meaning making. And it's kind of like culture not for the people, but by the people. So it's from the bottom up instead of the top down. And of course, I'm kind of ventriloquizing a little bit. I'm kind of giving you a very extreme version of this. You can see kind of the tendencies, but basically, it's not top down, right? So you talk about prosumers, you talk about fans, you talk about this kind of new social existence, which is a really positive thing. And it gives social uplift, it gives activity, productivity, identity formation, social networks, all this kind of stuff, right? But what I find sort of problematic about this is now, in a time when we're all fans, we sort of need to be reconsidering the networks in which we work and which we live, which we strive and thrive. So I find going back to Henry Jenkins' convergence culture useful, because he talks about effective economics, and effective economics are basically a way of cultivating desire in consumers, so the consumers will make a choice sort of subconsciously before they ever get to the marketplace. So it kind of is about cultivating or developing fan audiences, as some people have talked about it. So Jenkins says that effective economics sees active audiences potentially valuable if they can be courted and won over. And I think what I'd like to argue is that the way that you court and win over audiences, especially in the contemporary market, is through idols. And if idols seems like a too culturally specific term, think about influencers or media celebrity, that kind of thing. But basically, what I want to argue is that Japan, because it's so specific in terms of idols function in the media economy, we can begin to sort of see how it works. And then from there, we can ask questions about whether or not something does or doesn't make sense. So the first critical approach I'd like to talk about is the television model. So I'm going to break it into television and then the effective model. The television model is also effective economics, but it's kind of mediated, right? So basically, it has its roots in the late 19th and the early 1970s. when there was a kind of saturation of media images and commodities, what some people call a media commodity system that's integrated and based around television. So the model is kind of focused on presenting you with commodities and media side by side, integrated into a way. And idols are what make this work. So I'm going to skip ahead with some of this. If you're interested, we can talk a little bit later about some of the origins of the industry and how it all works, like during the idol boom and all of that. But what's important is that from the early 1970s, people began to be called idols, and they began to appear in idol production shows. So the most important one of these is Birth of a Star. Birth of a Star was founded in 1971, and it formed all different kinds of idol groups like Yamaguchi Momoe and Pink Lady and all of this, right? And it became pretty clear that anyone could become an idol if they were promoted through the system, and if they were promoting side by side commodities, those commodities would sell. So Pink Lady had what's called the Pink Lady bump. Whatever they were promoting would jump out, and so people would jump up in sales. So people realized that they were onto something here, and about 700 new idols debuted in Japan in 1975 when Pink Lady came out. So what I want to talk about is how this system was challenged and then reconfigured itself. So it was challenged during the so-called Idol Ice Age, when basically after the death of Okada Yukiko and some other things, the 80s model of sort of overproduction, overstimulation, that model started to be challenged and started to die down. And so you ended up with a kind of dead period for idols. There were some that did make it through, but for a long period, people thought idols weren't really viable anymore. And that was challenged by reconfiguring sort of the way that did effective economics. In other words, spending more time with television with idols became the sort of driving force behind the media commodity system. So the perfection of this TV model, which began in the 1970s, is going to be with Johnny's Jimmy Show. And when I mention Johnny's Jimmy Show, Johnny and Associates, what probably first comes to mind for you now, because of the recent news, is the abuse scandal of the former president and founder of the company. And so that's exactly why I want to talk about this. I think that it's important to understand why someone like him was in power and what that power allowed him to do. So basically, he gamed the system in a very important, in a very powerful way, very persuasive way. And by doing so, he became unmovable. The founder, Johnny's and Associates, became unmovable, irreplaceable in the industry. And so he was basically able to bargain with his idols when everyone sort of turned a blind eye, knowing that what was happening behind closed doors. So the system kind of became ripe for abuse because it was so integrated into this media commodity system with idols in the center, and it's most importantly SMAP and Arashi, who I'll talk about right now. So basically, from the mid 1990s, this idea that the television model would be centralized and would be the new kind of way to integrate the market that was breaking apart due to media convergence, global competition, all of that. We ended up sort of seeing male idols like SMAP beat the rap. There's the end of idols, people were saying, but instead they actually began to get almost near constant media exposure with their sort of vision of new masculinity. And Kimura Takia is probably the most glaring example of this, but they were appearing across media platforms, multiple TV shows, multiple appearances, multiple advertisements every day. So the chances of you seeing at least one of the members of SMAP once a day was about 100% at that time. So they were very much a kind of part of everyone's everyday life, right? And so, because of that, they became dense carriers of information that were read intertextually. And I'll talk about this a little bit more in a second. But basically, they become a way in which they're not talking about themselves; they're talking about the entire existence that they. So when Kimura Takia cuts his hair in a TV show, that then carries over into his performance on a variety show that carries over into his performance in an advertisement. People are watching all of them intertextually, right? Comparing the text to one another to create meaning. And the sort of center of that, the node that makes it possible, is the idol, right? So basically, this led to a viewing experience that's known as intimate in the industry. So here's an example of this. Does anyone have any idea what's going on here? So it's kind of like an idol being watched by an idol talking about a baseball player, right? But it turns out that what's happening here, if you're reading the Japanese along with me, is basically this particular idol from Morning Musume was called Dave Johnson, right? And the reason why it turns out is because during her first appearance on Utaban in 1999, she was told by another person that she appeared like Dave Johnson. And that person called her Dave Johnson until her final appearance on the show in 2010. It became kind of like inside baseball, if you'll uh, allow the pun. So they're basically playing this game of who knows that she's Dave Johnson? Do they know why she's Dave Johnson? Is it because of the lip? Is it because of her persona? All of this stuff kind of became part of this inner dialogue that makes the watching of the show really significant. So if you go back to the image now, you can see the idol watching and laughing as you sort of see the person talking about how she was called this other person's name by another celebrity. Right. So that's an example of the dense intertextuality that exists in idols at this time. And so, as I mentioned, you can really see it becoming obvious when you look at trendy dramas, because trendy dramas were based on lifestyle choices. They were very hyper focused on a particular moment in time, and they almost always featured idols. If you're familiar with K-pop and the way that works, it's very similar to this. So you have this kind of trendy drama model where you're appearing in television shows that speak not about the theme, but about yourself as an idol and how you are growing and changing and what performances you can and can't do. And other people are looking at that and saying, oh my goodness, this tells us so much about Kim Taku. It tells us so much about Kimura Takuya. It tells us so much about, this member of BTS or and so on and so forth. So basically, the tight production schedules mean that you have these idols who sort of are slotted into a performance before the before the character is even written in some cases, and it's written for them to sort of challenge their image and grow their image and grow their influence. These are advertisements for businesses, they're advertisements for services, they're also advertisements for idols. So sometimes I call these one more example of idol media. So if you're keeping track, you have television, you have advertisements, you have trendy dramas, all of this kind of appearing side by side as examples of idol media. And if you think about it, at some point, it all becomes idol media, right? All of it becomes a way to watch idols perform across their platforms. Now, to get back to the critical approach, what does this mean? This means that we're not thinking about the music, we're not thinking about the performance, we're thinking about the person, right? We're thinking about the produced and promoted media personality that becomes center to our experience. So it's not necessarily about music. It's about kind of how you tune in and uh, sort of zoom in on this particular performer and see them across their different platforms of performance, whether this be an advertisement or whether this be a sort of content that isn't an advertisement. It ceases to really make a difference between the two. So you can sort of see some of the different ways that this works. So Kimura Takuya was getting about 41.3% of households watching his trendy dramas. About 70% of adverts were in idol media in 2001. In 2002, every television viewer encountered Snap at least once a week. By 2004, the four largest impetuses to buy music were network television programs, television dramas, songs used in commercials, and songs used in television commercials. So all of this was kind of part of this generating this machine that generates desire around idols. I'll repeat that. It's not that the person has desire and then goes to the commodity. This particular model that we're working with right now suggests that the idol generates desire, right? And so that comes first, and then you have the people who are coming to the television, coming to the store, right? So essentially, the company was able to use this compounded star power. This is just one group. He has a whole stable of performers. Essentially, they were able to blackmail and control television. They were able to say, like, if you want my guys, don't put on Da Pump. If you've ever heard of that group, Da Pump was actually kicked out of the industry because Johnny's and Associates said, if you want them, you can't have my guys on your music programs. So they basically killed this group before they could ever really achieve their success. Now, in the sort of aftermath of the death of Johnny Kitagawa, we're seeing more and more emphasis on the story of DePump as maybe like a missing or a new star rising in the aftermath of Johnny's and Associates. So just one more quick example of television, the television model. So I want to talk a little bit about SMAP, and this will be just a quick, tight example. But if you look at the members of SMAP, they're kind of like the next generation of Arashi. And if you sort of go onto websites and sort of look at the response to them appearing in, for example, this JAL advertisement for Japan Airlines, if you look at this advertisement and you look at the response, there's all kinds of people who are replaying the video, sharing the video, analyzing the video, breaking down the video, all of this kind of happening, despite it being just the idols basically jumping from a building and onto the side of a JAL plane. So what happened was fans began to notice that this member, the second from the right, Ono, was jumping for real, they said. So in the advertisement. So ask yourself, when they're evaluating his performance, like it's a real performance, he's actually jumping, he's actually engaging in the content. How do they know that he jumped for real? They've watched so much content with him that they can sort of look at his face, look at his movements, and say, well, he actually did jump, right? The others kind of look at their posing. He looks like he actually made that jump. So basically, what this gives us is a perfect example of the audience commodity, right? Now, sometimes referred to as the attention economy. But basically, the way this works is in exchange for watching commercials, you're given content, right? This is the old TV model, right? And it's kind of similar today when you watch an advertisement on a YouTube video, you're able to watch that advertisement, then get the free content, right? So sometimes people will say, if you don't know what's being sold or why it's free, you're probably the commodity. So this is the first example of that from Dallas Smythe. And Dallas Smythe, who's a sort of a member of a more contemporary version of the attention of the audience commodity, argues that basically you're sold to advertisers. And you could have better or worse commodities, right? Audience commodities. Like if you do more work, if you're watching more intensely, watching more content, you become a more valuable member of the audience, a more valuable commodity. This is kind of taking Henry Jenkins and then sort of dialing it in with the example to see kind of just how important it really is to have audience commodities and to sort of see how you can then uh, cultivate a better audience, right? So fans are choosing to consume this idle content and they're spreading it around in social media, on their blogs, all of this, right? This gives us kind of like free advertisement, free work, free labor, right? In some ways for the producers of these idols. So ask yourself in this juxtaposition I'm putting down, which of the two is an actual advertisement and which is idle content, which is content for a television studio. And it turns out that they're both idle content. They're both advertisements. One of them is SMAP Arashi appearing with Mario. The other is Arashi playing the new Mario game in their bedroom, in their shared apartment, using the Wii. But either way, right, you can sort of see how you are mixing content into the everyday, mixing advertisement content into the everyday idle content that makes it much more effective. It ceases to matter that you're watching advertisements. Instead, you end up wanting, pursuing advertisements as idle content. You tune in, you show up, you buy in, right? This is what the media commodity system needs. So it's beyond what Jenkins is saying, because it's not just that we are cultivated or courted when we are active. It's actually that we are exactly, as fans, what the media commodity system needs. It needs us to function, right? Especially in this densely populated idle economy in Japan, which again we can sort of see as a kind of analogous to a lot of our lived worlds outside of Japan as well, when we're following idols, following social influencers, and things like that. So by introducing that kind of more contemporary angle, what I'm trying to say is that we're not talking about something that's specifically Japanese. Like if you look at idol groups in the United States, you can actually find that, and also other parts of the world, you can find that they were existing for a long, long time. And in fact, they influenced the production of Japanese idols in some ways. And if you look at, for example, the Backstreet Boys and NSYNC, they had the same producer, right? The same producer who said, famously, you know, Heinz doesn't have one kind of ketchup, so why should I have one kind of idol, right? So basically, treating them as commodities to be diversified to allow him to spam the system, which of course he did, and inspired all kinds of other idols to be produced in the 1990s and caused the male idol boom at that time. We can also see in the American Idol example that Henry Jenkins looks at. Basically, it's a cultivation of a fan audience in relation to idols, right? You have millions of people watching every night, millions of people calling in to place their vote. And basically, this was kind of the perfect example for Jenkins of an effective economics, right? So it's American Idol, right? Not American musician. And if you look at it, it's very much kind of like the way that brands are sold is the way these idols are being sold as love marks, brand communities, to loyals, to brand advocates, to inspirational consumers. All these terms he's using are kind of pointing us to a fan audience, which has been perfectly cultivated in the Japanese case over the course of decades now. And if you look at the way that they actually dealt with their advertising, this is a member of the American Idol who sang in a Ford commercial, appeared in a Ford commercial, and all the other members appeared in the same Ford commercial, selling their own, showing how popular they could make the music and how good they could make the music. And then the fans were watching and saying, well, I want to sort of see how my idol performs, stacks up against other idols. In other words, just like in Japan, you can sort of see how the advertisement becomes content for the idol, right? You have, just like in Japan, competition between performers and their audiences. So when Ruben Studdard wins, Clay Aiken fans kind of rally and then push him to the top of the sales chart to sort of show that the show made the wrong decision, right? So in this way, you have the active audience literally competing to make their sales of their idol larger than the other group, to show how popular that person is and to show that they are the actual American Idol, right? If you're familiar with how idols work, like BTS, this is very much what they did. They used social media to get their fans, the army, to mobilize, to help them sort of make their video releases huge, make their CD releases and streaming releases huge, right? So that's kind of what we're seeing in this early example of American Idol, right? So Jenkins calls this a fantasy of empowerment, right? That helps, sort of, the promise of participation helps to build fan investments, right? Fans are rallying around their favorite idols and pushing them to the top, right? And this is not new. So if you go all the way back to 1941, you can see examples of basically people putting in votes to sort of decide who's going to be the face of a particular beer company. And that whole example shows us that basically more people were voting for the Rheingold beer girl than they were voting for the president, right? So it's very much a participation and a fantasy of empowerment through the participation in the election. So Francesco Alberoni says that basically what we're seeing here is a kind of election that's more or less rigged. Not that people are produced and then they are forced upon us, but instead people are put in front of us, right? Promoted, produced, and that then makes them candidates for election, right? And then through the kind of media system, media commodity system, we are seeing the retainment of favor from the electorate, right? From us as fans, right? They put them in front of us. So this leads us to the critical approach I want to talk about. So the critical approach that I would like to propose to you is going back again to the 1940s and look at how some of the people at that time, like Bornstein, like uh, like Jenkins, saw things that were going on around them, and they sort of began to discuss a critical approach to celebrity. They were talking mostly about the Hollywood system, but it's very much related to the world we live in today. I would argue it's almost eerie how similar it is to the world we live in today. But just to kind of give you an idea, they talked about the culture industry. And what the culture industry was, they said, was a loose grouping of corporations that produce mass culture or media and material culture for mass consumption. So they did this in pursuit of profit, not in pursuit of culture, right? So culture becomes a way to make money, right? So if you ask yourself, for example, why are all pop songs the same length, right? Why do they sound similar? Why aren't they 7 minutes long and they have an opera break, right? So we sort of see a formulation of a kind of standard, right? They call this sameness, right? So sameness becomes basically a standardization that is the characteristic of the logic of mass production, but it's masked by what they call pseudo individuation. Sometimes they call it the hook, right? So you have a kind of standardized form, and then you have a pseudo individuation that makes it seem different, but eventually you'll get bored of it, and then right then the next one comes out that gives you something that's similar but also a little bit different, right? So in that way, you're always consuming the same thing, but you're always kind of feeling it's new, right? This is very good for someone who's producing music that is more or less commodity, that is more or less standardized, right? For their production logic and for the way that they're standardizing and their output, right? With a kind of known response, right? They know they're going to get a big response, a big pop if they have this particular performer singing this particular song. And if you're familiar with, industry plants and things like that, I think what's more important than saying that they're false is saying that they work, right? Because they're kind of actually exposing in many ways the ways that the music industry works for in this. And it's the same for Hollywood, right? So think about the kind of leading man archetype. And if you look at Marvel movies, we have literally, and it's kind of like a funny little aside, but we have the four Chris's, right? We have all these different Chris's who appear as straight white men, right? And all of this is kind of giving us a repetition that becomes a desirable repetition, right? We want it to repeat. We actually are become trained listeners that makes it exciting when we actually get the difference. We're looking for that difference, but we're actually also looking for the similarity that makes it comparable. Okay. So the thing that I don't like about the Frankfurt School is it's Marxist inspired. So they put an awful lot of emphasis on labor, an awful lot of emphasis on basically how you're reproduced through your pleasure time, your consumption time. So consumption and rest and entertainment makes you more or less prepared for the next day at the office, right? So it's kind of part of a larger system where they say literally, um, you're more or less always going to be at work. You'll always be at work. You'll always be working either as in entertainment to reproduce yourself for work or working as in the actual office, right? So they basically argue that all of the products of the culture industry are basically made to be consumed in an alert but also distracted way. Does that sound familiar to some of us in social media? I hope it's kind of like clear that they're kind of speaking almost prophetically here. But again, I'm not so interested in this kind of idea that you're prolonging work under capitalism. So what I'd like to do is kind of reorganize their critique and say, well, wait a minute. What if we could update this to talk about individual agency, active audiences, and more complex dynamics of power? So it's not like capitalism is forcing us to be reproduced for our work, right? Or forcing us into a system where we accept whatever's given to us, right? What if we instead kind of took this critical political economy of media and communication and updated it through effective economics to reconsider kind of some of the insights that they had, right? So I'm not arguing that fans are anything other than active and productive, but I want to sort of argue that there's a structure in place, and this is what the Frankfurt School points us towards. There's a structure in place that actually enables and disables fan activity while valorizing it in particular ways. So if we look at the effective model of idols, this becomes really, really clear, right? So the effective model is just basically the direct contact, someone appealing to you directly for support, right? It's kind of a more primitive form of idols, but also a less mediated version where someone's on stage saying, please buy my CD, please come up and shake my hand, please take a picture with me. That kind of direct appeal where each of the direct contact points is translated into money. So if you want to support me, buy my CD. If you want to shake my hand, buy a ticket, right? That kind of thing, right? So the embodied encounter becomes the actual commodity, and that what you're buying is more or less a vehicle to carry it, right? So this is where idols become really significant. And if we look at AKB48, as I promised we would, if you look at AKB48, you can sort of see that these idols you can meet are very much operating in this effective model. They started in a very, very small theater, a very small venue in Akihabara that seated only a couple hundred people. And in that theater, you could actually see people on stage, sometimes like just a few feet away, and they would see you and you would see them, right? And then after that, you would do a high touch or shake their hand, and they'd be like, "Oh, I saw you in the theater. How are you doing?" So they basically were developing a direct relationship with their fans to come back to the theater and support them. They actually did this before they did television, so they were more or less a kind of direct idol commodity, like an underground idol group, only much larger and much more uh, mature in their economics. But when they became really popular in 2009, they had their big TV break, right? So they began to appear in television shows, advertisements, all that kind of thing. They were taken away from the theater increasingly, and now the theater is actually closed in Akihabara. But at the time, there's a tension between the direct contact and the mediated performance. So the kind of general audience and the fan audience. And Akimoto Yasushi, the guy who produced AKB48, figured out that what he could do is is mobilize those fan audiences and get them to spend money to sort of demonstrate how much they're invested in the group. This is a really interesting way that actually the popularization of the group inflamed the passions of the fan audience, who were given ways that they could interact, given ways they could participate into the uh, into the media performance. So basically, they had the general election from 2009, which was, again, the way that Akimoto figured out he could give these idols, um, give the fans a way to interact with their idols and support them. By supporting them, they would become more popular. They would appear in more advertisements, more music videos, appear in the central sort of position on stage, and things like that. So if you look at the numbers, what you find is from 2009, when the system was integrated first, when they first did the election, AKB48 was not in the top 10 Oricon singles of the year. After they did the election, they were number one and number two. right? So you're seeing kind of an increasingly popular group, and the popularity through the media is actually in encouraging people to buy those CDs and make their votes in the election. By 2011, the top five songs were all AKB48. And then by 2012, if you look at that, almost all top 10 were AKB48 or its sister groups, right? The only exception would be Arashi, who's kind of holding down spot 6 and 7. But really, it's amazing how much they're selling. Each of their songs are well over a million, kind of moving into the space of almost 2 million. And it gets even bigger, right? So another top four, but then they also got 7, 8, and 9. And if you look at the general election, it follows a similar pattern. So when Maeda Atsuko won the election in 2009, there's only 4,630 votes for her out of a total of 54,000 votes. The next year, we have Oshima Yuko winning, and she gets 31,000 votes, right? A huge number out of now 354 million, 354,000 votes. And then you look at Maida Atsuko coming back with her fandom, sort of supporting her return, just like the return of Clay Aiken, supporting that return. You sort of see the numbers going up past a million now for the top 40 members of the group. This kind of cools down a little bit in 2012 when the number of votes for the top winner was down. But if you look at the actual total number of votes, there's more votes being cast, so more votes across the different groups. Basically, people voting for the member they like, their Oshimen, instead of just the one they want to see as the center of the group, right? So this kind of translates to direct labor for the idols, right? Because they're actually out there shaking hands with thousands of these fans during these marathon events that they're doing to create this direct relationship, despite the scale being so much larger than it was when they started. Then we have the comeback of Sashihara Rino in 2013. And as you can see, the total number of votes for the top 64 was over 2 million now. So it's pretty important to see that the numbers are going up as their CD sales are going up. You might ask yourself, geez, Louise, CD sales in the 2010s? Exactly, right? This was basically a production of things nobody needs. Nobody wants the CDs, but they want them to get the ballot to make their vote. So again, notice how the form is reflecting an economic need that's based on affect between the idol and the fan, but not necessarily what's on the CD. It becomes literally disposable, right? You can switch it out, throw it away, that kind of thing. So if votes are love, as one member of AKB48 said, then you want to purchase more CDs and place more votes to sort of show how much you love someone. That's the kind of patronage system. The patronage system is a really important example of how this works. But you can see kind of like how someone purchases thousands of CDs, sells them back to a CD store in Akihabara where the price goes down to like 50 cents for a new CD, basically, or they just toss them out. And people have been getting arrested for throwing away bulk CDs. This last picture is actually one person's voting block for their idol. So basically, Horkheimer and Adorno tell us that this is what we should be expecting to happen, right? They say literally, the culture industry, quote, artfully sanctions the demand for trash, and in so doing, inaugurates a total harmony, right? Again, it's too much. It's not a total harmony. It's not all trash. But in this case, we can literally see how this insight shows us what's going on in the election, right? It's showing us how people are showing up to vote for their idol, not to listen to the music necessarily, right? So the need is fabricated, right? Just as the Frankfurt School says that it would be. You have a colossal waste, but it serves the needs of a system in harmony. So Horkheimer and Adorno, and I want to sort of end on this note. Horkheimer and Adorno say basically that choice is an illusion. Something is provided for everybody so that no one can escape, right? So in the case of idols, in the case of AKB48, this is quite obvious, right? You have all the members you can choose from, but then all their sister groups you can choose from, all their sort of official rivals you can choose from. We're talking about hundreds and hundreds of idols at this point, all in the same quote family, and they have other people who are competing with them to promote their idols and promote their effective economics. It creates a system where there's tons of idols in competition, and we get to choose the one we like, but at the same time, it's like choosing the box of cereal you like, right? It was put there in front of you, this with pseudo individuation to sort of mask the sameness of the product, right? So how much attraction is really involved in this making of a choice? Can you make a choice when you're on your back, when the system is kind of rigged in many ways? And again, I won't say too much about it, but Akimoto Yasushi has been very open about the fact that he wants to be the one who more or less promotes the idols, not produces them, but promotes them and then makes money off of them producing themselves, right? So, somewhat bombastically, Horkheimer and Adorno, the guys who came up with the culture industry approach, they said the industry bows to the vote that it itself is rigged, right? I think that's a really interesting way to think about all of this. And now, today, we're in a sort of idol warring states period where there's tons and tons of different groups competing for attention, competing for votes, for love, right? And it goes from about 50 underground idols to about 350 in 2015, much more copy idol groups, tons of professional idol groups. All of this, is part of this kind of more or less blurred boundary between professional and amateur, between university and high school idols and actual idols and all of that, right? So you have lots of different ways you can look at this. Some really good examples online of looking at the idol war in states period. I've written a little bit on the Unidol event. If you're interested, I'm happy to sort of talk about that. But it's kind of an example of university students becoming idols as part-time work. And then on top of that, they become actual functioning idols in the industry, right? And K-pop, we could talk about that as well, because K-pop, John Lee argues, is basically creating a quote reserve army of potential K-pop stars by these catchy tunes, these memeable and mimicable um, dance movements, and all of that. It sort of is made for a kind of economy of TikTok, if you want to think about it that way. It's very much perfectly balanced for the environment in which it exists, right? And this is sort of showing us the idol phenomenon is spreading globally, right? So I'll skip this, but basically, culture industry suggests that basically all of us are a kind of talent, right? And the industry is searching for talent. Anyone could be the next talent, but we're not, right? So we both identify with the person and then we also see the difference between us and the person. That creates a kind of aspirational relationship between the person and ourselves, but also it makes us kind of happy to be who we are because we see ourselves reflected in our idols, right? So this is very much a critique of social media and the attention economy as well. Okay, and I'll go ahead and end there. So I hope to have some questions and discussion. Um, Ask me anything. I'm happy to answer. So if you look at the underground idols, so-called underground idols, or the internet idols, social media influencers, things like that, they definitely are much more leaning into social media as a way to promote themselves. Like they'll be giving you their handle, follow me on this platform, follow me on that platform. So they're kind of like no longer shying away from that. It's just one more tool they can use to create a continuous bond with their audience, and then encourage them to show up and to make a purchase. So it's very much kind of like part of their toolkit. I think what's interesting though, you mentioned K-pop, the success of K-pop and their use of social media has made some companies like really reconsider their strategy. Because a lot of the idols that I worked with, in Johnny's and Associates and things like that, they didn't really have social media accounts. They didn't really have a way that they could perform that, and they were so controlled by the company that it was like even their photographs, like you couldn't share your photograph because that was sort of not company property, but it was like, we're selling your photograph as a bromide, if you can believe it. Back in the 2000s, they were selling physical photographs of idols in Japan. So it was like, well, because we're selling it, we can't let you give it away for free. That's crazy. But now, I think with the success of K-pop, they realize that this is a huge way to influence fans and get them to follow and to support. So if you look at some of the younger members of Johnny's and Associates, which now is kind of like rebranded, a different name, a different set of producers and all of that. But if you look at the company, a lot of their younger idols actually, first of all, broke the rules and began to do like funny videos. And that those funny videos were memeable, and so they got them new attention. And then the producers realized, oh wow, I can support this. I can actually be a part of this. And this was also um, they were also benefited by having international producers. So they finally allowed non-Japanese people to be involved in the production, and I think that really opened up new doors because all of these producers were like, well, why shouldn't we do social media? Why shouldn't we be approaching people where they are? So it's definitely changing in the last couple of years.
Is social media freeing the idols from the grips of the producers in charge? Now, thanks to TikTok, Instagram, heck, even other platforms, you have people who are able to make themselves be their own person. Are you seeing disruptors in the industry, and then are you seeing the industry itself fight back in trying to ban these disruptors from maybe performing in certain venues or stop them from getting certain opportunities that would otherwise be available to them?
Yeah, great question. So I think that you're absolutely right with your observation that there's so many people who are now like able to produce themselves, and they don't have the same machinery behind them, right? So it's a difference in scale. You're not like going to be the next Kimono Takia, but you are going to be popular with your own audience, and you can survive with a couple hundred people, even less. I've known idols who have 20 to 50 members who are their core audience, and they're really appealing to those people to come show up to their shows and support them, and so on. So you can self-produce these days, and I think that has liberated a lot of people. There's a great article out on the Electronic Journal of Contemporary Japanese Studies about underground idols, which talks a little bit about this. There's a way that it can be freeing, but also when you become a self-produced idol or a kind of independent agent, as you said, you do get sort of screwed around with by the industry, who won't work with you in many cases because you're not part of the machinery. You don't have an agency that can go to bat for you, and so they use them really like a sky stay. They use them in a sort of like quickly disposable way, right? So they're not thinking about the future of the idol. The idol is kind of making sense of it as their own way to promote and to get their audience together. So it's both pros and cons, but there are definitely a lot of self-produced, self-promoting idols these days.
Awesome. We have a question here from the audience. Paul says Oshikatsu has become a buzzword in the content industry recently, but how different is this approach or trend from earlier promotion strategies? Does this represent strategies or ideas expanding out from the strictly defined idol industry to the more broad media industries?
Yeah, thank you so much. That's a great question. So oshikatsu absolutely is kind of now one of the buzzwords in the idol industry, and it's interesting that it's kind of being used for a lot more of the women's side of things. Whereas AKB48 Oshimen, it's very similar, right? So that the member that you support, they were already talking about this in AKB48, but it was kind of like, oh, those fans over there, they're doing this kind of like they're overly invested, they're kind of crazy, they're buying all these CDs and things like that. But if you look at Oshikatsu, if you look at the literature, and there's a rich literature in Japanese now, if you look at the literature, a lot of people are really super positive about it. They're talking about, oh, it's great that people are consuming products that give them meaning, give them joy. They're sharing that. It's kind of like a positive social uplift for them and for everyone around them. We should be supporting this. It's good for mental health, some people argue. So it's become really, this is one of the reasons why I wanted to give this critical approach, because I think that right now, this kind of unquestioned assumption that idols are really very, very good. And Oshikatsu is a very good thing for everyone involved. But I kind of wonder about the performers, the producers, and then also the fans, how all of us are kind of being structured in our relationships.
Nice. We have another question here. Someone said, can you talk a bit more about the VTuber industry? Do you think it would provide an alternative system for idols? And I do also know there's, one of the big ones in Japan is Live, I believe. And I know there's been some drama surrounding that recently with some of the idols kind of complaining about the management and things like that. So could you maybe like touch upon that a little bit or?
Yeah, absolutely. So I got into VTubers a couple years back with a friend, Mark Bookman, who was hugely invested in Hololive, especially was his favorite. And so I sort of just sort of follow along with him. And I thought it was really interesting because, you had in that case, mostly people who were being produced or held down by management in a really Japanese way, if you want to call it that, where it's very much kind of like you're now a member of the Jimusho, the agency, and then the agency is going to take care of you, but also watch out and then make sure nothing you don't go too far, nothing hurts you. I think sort of compared to that, if you look at something like V Shoujo was very interesting because like what they did was they basically took people who were known performers already in the industry, like who were already performing their own idol personas, and they're in many cases their own sort of VTuber personas, picked them up and then gave them new characters to play. So it's really interesting that it isn't like there isn't like this way that a scandal can kill a VTuber the same way or that kind of thing because they have multiple masks that they're playing with. And I think that to your point about can it be liberating, I think absolutely yes. Because if you are known to be a fiction, right, you can sort of remove that mask if you want to, but you can keep it on and then talk through the mask, and the mask can sort of become in many ways the object of everyone's attention, and it's not you, right? So everyone knows that it's a performed fiction, right? And I didn't get a chance to talk about that today, but there's a really long history in Japan of basically this fictional play with characters that I think VTubers are part of, and I think it can be liberating if people know that it isn't you. You don't have to have like your bleeding heart exposed all the time for people to then make comments, play with your character, cross the line, that kind of thing. It happens in a way that it's more mutual, like a mutual image exchange.
Awesome. I don't see any more questions on here for you. So with that, I really appreciate you coming on to CasaCon to provide this information. If you can actually put the name of the person who you mentioned, Matt Bookman, is that what you said his name was?
Oh, Mark, yeah,
Yeah.
Mark Bookman, yeah, he was great. He passed away, unfortunately, but yeah, he and I wrote together on VTubers. So I can put it into the chat.
Yeah.
Thank you. Take care.